Every once in a while, I just have something I want to vent about a topic that is completely unrelated to electronics. In this case, Brexit, as viewed by a Dutchman very close to the UK, fairly close ties to the UK, but not actually in the UK. I like to call these segments Mux Rants, because I'm Mux and this is just a rant. Just to be clear, I will be mostly making teardown videos. I will try to keep these ranty videos to a minimum. On June 23rd, Great Britain will be voting on leaving the EU, which is a statutory right of any EU member. Actually, one of these referendums has happened before, when it was still the EEC. In 1975, back then, the United Kingdom had a referendum to remain or exit the EEC, and back then the vote was 67% yes, so they stayed. And through the years, there has always been a fairly strong undercurrent, which is very unique for the UK, that they don't really want to be part of the EU. This is evident in, for instance, their unique position on the Schengen area. They are not part of the Schengen area, so you cannot freely move to or from the UK. Likewise, they're not part of the Eurozone. This is slightly less unique in the EU, but it's still one of the only countries that doesn't use the euro. And they have a very large amount of other exceptions. They have a total of something like 70 exceptions to EU treaties and regulations. This is fine. This is how the EU works. The EU is not a United States of Europe. In the United States, for instance, the United States of America, there is no formal procedure to withdraw from the Union. If you're a state forever. The only way to get out is either through diplomacy or through violence. So I would say, as an outsider, I'm a Dutchman. We are a very happy part of the EU. We wouldn't really want to leave, honestly. This just seems like a normal procedure to me. Like, people can vote on whether they want to remain or want to go, and they do the vote, and then it's done, right? However, if you take a look at YouTube videos on Brexit, the most viewed videos on YouTube are just conspiracy videos. Let's have a look at one of them.
200,000 British businesses, just 4% trade with the EU, and yet 100% must comply with their literally countless regulations.
No, this is just wrong. First of all, these regulations don't exist for no reason. These regulations are mostly common sense stuff, safety stuff, standardization throughout countries, stuff that makes trade easier. Take, for instance, Senelec. Senelec is something I am very, very, very grateful for, because it has brought the Schuko mains connector standard to most of Europe and Asia. This enables me, as an electronic designer, to design one product that works on electronic mains connections in something like 50 countries. Even outside the EU, there are countries that design their electrical standards towards Senelec. None of these purported pesky EU rules that I guess are implied in this video don't serve anything useful are going to go away if you exit the EU, because you're still going to need to trade with the EU, so you're still going to need to comply with the rules of the EU, for instance CE rules and Senelec.
This endless red tape kills innovation, with compliance costing us billions each month. To contrast, when we trade with the USA and China, we sensibly apply their regulations only to the things they buy, not to our entire domestic economy.
So you're saying that that toaster that you sold to the US is made specifically to US standards, and the toaster you sold domestically is much simpler and only has the minimum requirements for the UK. That's not how trade works. That's not how mass production works. You make something that complies to everything, and specifically, it complies to something like UL, or CSA, or VDE. Once it complies with one of these regulatory bodies, it automatically applies to everything.
Post-Brexit, the EU may well put up barriers to trade. However, by leaving the world's only stagnant trade bloc, we'll be free to increase trade with the rest of the growing and prosperous world.
This again is totally fallacious. First of all, you're free to trade with anyone. That's the idea of world trade. The EU puts up no barriers for you to trade with other countries. And second of all, you cannot just float off the UK to China and just park it there just in front of the coast and only trade with China. Your geographic location puts constraints on which countries you can most economically trade with.
And besides, considering our huge imports from German industries and our £8 billion trade deficit, with the Eurozone in crisis and increasing bailouts needed just to prop it up, keeping these trade barriers low is very much in Europe's interest.
You're making this seem as if the EU would suffer a great economic loss if the UK exits the European Union. But in fact, the converse applies. The UK would have a giant economic problem because more than 50% of UK GDP is derived from trade with Europe, whereas less than 5% of trade from other EU countries has anything to do with the UK. Given that the geographic location won't actually permit the UK to really switch partners that much, the EU has nothing to lose.
Many countries far smaller than Britain have negotiated global trade deals worth trillions, and we could too. The EU's trade agreements in comparison are crap, even if we include their internal markets. Being in the EU is in fact the very best way to stifle international trade.
This is just an assertion without any source. The EU is still one of the largest trading blocs, one of the most prosperous areas in the world. Yes, there are areas that have higher growth numbers, but those are also areas that have lower absolute wealth. Assertions like these just seem like scaremongering to me.
As a member of the EU, of the 7.4 billion people on the earth, it's nearly impossible for 93% of them to have any chance of coming to Britain because the 6% who are European have open access.
What? How can you twist stuff more? This is madness. What?
This is a xenophobic little Europe attitude and is simply not right. We're turning away the world's best and brightest because the EU currently force us to accept unlimited migration from countries with stagnant economies and up to 50% youth unemployment.
No, where the hell did you get this from? There is no rule that says you have to choose migrant workers from within the EU first or something. No, what the fuck? You can just get them from anywhere you want. Pick and choose. Let them come in, no problem. There you go.
If we leave the EU, Britain can have equal borders, where we sensibly welcome people equally for who they are, and not simply the colour of their passport.
Yeah, this is pretty much the same way it is now. You already have equal borders because you're not part of the Schengen area. So you have closed borders. You have to show your passport, and only then you can come in or not. And the equal borders argument is like the opposite. What you're saying is, well, our borders are more closed for non-EU citizens than for EU citizens. So let's close them more for the EU so we have equal borders? How the fuck is that an argument? That's not an equal borders argument. That's a close the borders argument. That's saying we don't want any immigration.
So the EU today is a bit of a mess, but where is it going and can it be reformed? To understand that, we need to know where it came from. After World War I, many rich and powerful Europeans wanted to create a United States of Europe, and in 1926, 2,000 of them met in Vienna to work out how they might do it.
Just notice the very slight conspiratorial undertone of, oh, the Bilderbergers are going to make a new world order type bullshit.
5 years later, long before World War II, a British civil servant named Arthur Salter published a collection of papers entitled The United States of Europe that bizarrely argued the national governments of Europe should be made mere local authorities of a new federal state and national identities erased. However, the craziest part of Salter's vision was that the central power of this new state should be held by an unelected and unaccountable secretariat, who would rule Europe without any democratic mandate from the people. Salter believed that they alone should ultimately control Europe. It's interesting to see just how similar the unique structure of Salter's 1931 United States of Europe is to the EU of today. They are exactly the same, and the man who made this happen was Salter's friend, the charismatic federalist Jean Monnet.
No, you don't have to bother going into commissions and the European Parliament and representation and voting. The fact that everybody has its own rules on pretty much everything. Just assert that it's essentially a monarchy and that nobody can say anything, and go on with the video. Like, you have nice animations. You don't need proof.
World War II came and went. Monet then made two significant attempts to kickstart federalism, but both failed. His breakthrough came in 1950 when the USA gave France an ultimatum. France had been demanding control of German coal and steel industries, a move bitterly opposed by both Britain and the US. In 1950, France was finally given only 2 months to propose a reasonable compromise, or else the Allies would impose a solution on all parties. Monet spent these months drafting a memorandum, and with only 1 week remaining, he presented it to the desperate French Foreign Minister, Robert Schuman. Renamed the Schuman Plan, it was broadcast across Europe on May 9, 1950, declaring a supranational coal and steel community would be created as the foundation for a future United States of Europe. Consequently, the heavy industries of 6 European nations came under the control of the unelected and unaccountable, aptly named High Authority, and Monet had planted the seed of a federal Europe.
Sure, that is everything. That is the complete story. I'm sure there are no other reasons than one guy wanting to make a new world order.
5 years later, the Treaties of Rome expanded the coal and steel community to become the EEC, and the High Authority was renamed as the friendlier sounding European Commission.
No, this is not how it happened. Since the Treaty of Rome, it had already been called the Commission of the European Economic Community. In 1965, there was the Merger Treaty, where the High Authority and the Commission plus the Commission for the European Atomic Energy Community all merged together to form the Commission of the European Communities. And that eventually, in 2007, with the Lisbon Treaty, became the European Commission, which is just a slight name change. So this is not a friendlier name thing to spoon feed it to non-suspecting people. It was already there, basically. This has already always been the name. So again, I just want to highlight that this is just all a big conspiracy theory. This is a New World Order conspiracy theory.
In 1973, our government took Britain into the EEC, and 2 years later, 67% of us voted to remain in it, largely because our government promised us that it would only ever be a common market, never a political union. In 1992, political union was announced. What a shock.
So again, here, this is just a big historical retcon of some kind. At the time, there was no fear of political union. This was not a thing. The fears that people had entirely to do with the common market. So back then, one of the big issues was if you go into the common market, it becomes much easier. Essentially, the common market means that you cannot impose import duties on goods and services from within the EU, or back then the EEC. And one of the fears was that cheaper food from, for instance, south of France and Germany would outcompete the British agricultural market. So one of the parts of the deal was relatively high agricultural subsidies for the UK, which remain to this day. Likewise, the UK has always been a fairly strong economic power within Europe, and they feared that countries with cheaper labor would overtake especially low-paid jobs. This seems to be a theme for every generation, pretty much. And quite controversially, back then, one of the claims was that food prices would go up and a lot of jobs in the UK would be lost if the UK would remain in the EEC. And history tells us pretty much that none of this happened. The UK has benefited tremendously, especially with the big market opportunities and the very large influx of financial companies. Anyway, all this goes to say, I know a few things about this referendum of 1975, and it was not about fears about political union. It was just not a theme back then.
The Treaty of Maastricht increased the power and jurisdiction of the EEC and renamed it the European Union, so after 61 years, Salter's vision was almost complete. In 2004, the European Union attempted to seal the deal by introducing a constitution for Europe, which would finally bind the member states under its federal jurisdiction, permanently.
No. No, this is patently false. In fact, the TCE, as it's known, a treaty establishing a constitution for Europe, which eventually got passed as the Lisbon Treaty, actually provided a new clause that specifies a way for member countries to leave unconditionally. If a member state chooses to leave, and they announce this in the European Parliament, and Parliament says, okay, we're going to give you 2 years. Within these 2 years, we're going to try to renegotiate and do some diplomacy. If nothing comes of it, you leave anyway. And if you change your mind, you're still in the Union. So this is not a permanent federated states of Europe. This is just bullshit.
If enacted, the countries of Europe, including Britain, would, legally speaking, cease to exist, and a new country under the authority of the European Commission would take their place. The United States of Europe would have been founded. Thankfully though, in most countries only through a referendum of the people can a state relinquish sovereignty, and in 2005 the people of Europe said no.
The Dutch and the French said no, the UK actually said yes. So... Also, nation states were still recognized as sovereign. The difference though is that the European Union right now is a collection of commissions, and after that it would actually be a singular entity. That's what we voted for.
Following this setback, Angela Merkel quietly conspired with other federalists to repackage the rejected constitution using different terminology without changing the legal substance of the text so as to avoid referendums. And in 2009, the Treaty of Lisbon was ratified. The incremental federalization of Europe was complete, except for one final thing. Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty allows states to withdraw from the Union. The final step in founding the United States of Europe will be to amend the treaties and remove Article 50, which won't require a referendum. With that done, the Commission and its court will be the rulers of our laws.
Yeah, totally logical. First, we're going to make all kinds of rules that establish exceptions and allow people to go away from the Union and do all that. And then we're going to remove them secretly. Also, we're going to replace all the laws of every country. There's a slight point, a hint of a point, in that, yes, the European Union is striving to streamline regulations within the EU, in that a subset of laws have to be followed by all countries, and countries cannot make laws themselves that oppose these rules. The catch, though, is that these rules that are introduced as laws have to be voted in by either a supermajority or unanimously, and these laws are only a fairly small subset of the actual legislative and executive permission of the EU. All of this means that no, there is still not a federated states of Europe, even with a full European constitution. That's just bullshit. The amount of simplification in this video to try to propagandize just this conspiratorial point is mind-boggling, truly mind-boggling.
It's an open secret in Brussels that the European Union is to have a single currency, a single body of law, and a single military. If nothing is done, it will become a single country, as has been the intention since the 1920s. A vote to remain is a vote to become the 28th state of this fledgling empire and accepting everything that comes with it, and promises to the contrary are simply PR.
Given that so far you've presented a conspiracy theory without any actual evidence, and the evidence that you've tried to put forth is easily misproven, it seems like you're doing some PR here.
This June is likely the last time the people of Britain will be consulted on membership. If we choose to give up our sovereignty now, there will likely be no getting it back.
Except through Clause I-60, the official procedure to actually withdraw from the Union.
This is not about trade, this is not about travel, and this is certainly not about the economy. Know what you're voting for. This is about the future of a sovereign Britain and whether or not we as individuals value our freedom. If you still intend to vote Remain, before June 23rd, please take a moment to watch these excellent videos to get a fuller understanding of what's actually at stake here, and perhaps read this book for a complete history of the EU if there's time.
So, that was the video. I just want to close off. This video got 150,000 views. Pretty much there are a couple of popular videos on Brexit. They're mostly pro-Brexit, i.e. to vote to leave the European Union. this video actually gives a fairly good overview of the type of arguments that are usually given in these videos. To me, it honestly sounds like a big conspiracy theory. And for a large part, like I live very close to Britain. I am very heavily influenced by British culture, even though I try to speak American vernacular English. British culture has always had this conspiratorial, mistrusting undercurrent when it comes to Europe. And whether it's the European Union or individual countries in Europe, often problems within the UK, actual domestic problems, are reflected upon Europe or are actually blamed on Europe in some way. And likewise, the whole immigration issue, the Syrian refugee crisis, but before that, Italian economic crisis, Greece, Spain, there have been many instances where the UK has been extremely vocal about, oh my God, the world is going to end. I don't want to downplay stuff like Greece, which was just a massive fuck up within the EU from many sides, especially from the German and Greek side, but basically also from the rest of the EU. Also, I don't want to paint the EU as a paradise of any kind. There are a couple of very arcane, very undemocratic things going on in the EU. But likewise, there are some very arcane and very undemocratic things going on in Britain and the Netherlands and Germany and everywhere else. I mean, Germany still has proper censorship. That is something that should not be allowed within the EU. Likewise, Britain and the Netherlands are kingdoms, as is Denmark. Those are fairly undemocratic systems in principle. Now, we do have a parliament and the crown has no real power anymore. But in principle, for instance, the British crown can disband the Australian parliament and House of Lords, or whatever it's called there, which is a completely undemocratic bullshit thing to have. These things exist in the EU. The EU is not perfect. The way the European Union functions, in many ways, things like financial austerity, those are highly controversial things. I don't want to downplay this. I don't want to say, you should all come to the EU. The EU is great. Why do you even want to leave? That's not the issue. What I'm saying here is that if you are presenting arguments, if you're trying to make a point for exiting the European Union, use actual points. Provide evidence that is relevant, that is correct, that corroborates your points. Use logic, maybe. Don't rely on stuff that is not common knowledge. And if you do, present sources. All these things. I just see nothing of this in the video, and I don't see any good arguments for a Brexit other than xenophobic arguments, conspiracy theory arguments, and immigration arguments, like actual immigration arguments, not xenophobia, but actually saying, we have a potential problem. A couple of states have fairly open borders to illegal immigrants. They can legalize within a year, and after that, they can pretty much go anywhere within the EU, and they can immigrate fairly easily within the UK as well. That is a potential problem. Now, for economic reasons, I don't think that's actually an issue. I don't think the whole immigration issue is an economic issue. It's mostly a political issue. But that would be an actual valid point. And I'm fine if you say that, oh, I don't want any Syrians in my country and therefore I want to leave the EU. That's a good argument because it follows logic. But this conspiracy theory bullshit, it just is based on nothing. I am very ashamed to say that I kind of like Sargon of Akkad, the channel that this video was on. But I'm just flabbergasted that he would allow this kind of drivel on his channel. He usually tries to use evidence and logic in his arguments. Well, this video has been very long. I'm very sorry to post a political video. And next time I will go back to doing electronic teardowns and just non-political stuff.